When Bruce Lee came along, he was the coolest person on earth. In the 1970s, when the Bruce Lee movies came out and I was a little kid, I was blown away.
The 1970s was a golden era for Chinese kung fu movies. And right at the heart of this movement was a young martial artist named Bruce Lee. He was charismatic, fierce, and capable of superhuman stunts that were so incredible, no one would believe them if they were not recorded. Join us as we take you deep into the story of one man who blurred the line between make-believe and reality, starting with one of his most fascinating stunts. The arena was packed to the brim, everyone watching, waiting for the first attack. Standing on the mat, a few meters from the barriers, was the legendary Bruce Lee, his sparring partner, and several martial arts students whose eyes were filled with the same longing as the crowd. Lee, standing mere inches from his sparring partner, studied the scene like a true master. He knew what to do to make the crowd go wild. The chair on the stage was proof that he'd done this before and definitely didn't want to hurt the sparring partner. Then, at just the right moment, he pushed out his fist, and down went the other guy straight into the chair that had been perfectly placed to catch his fall. That was the 1-inch punch. And yes, it's exactly what the name sounds like. Imagine standing just 1 inch away from your opponent and delivering a strike so powerful it could knock him clean off the ground. It wasn't about the power or the muscle mass or the physical difference between Lee and his opponent. This was a skill that only a true martial artist could master, just like Lee did, and every fan who has walked the same path of knowledge and discipline he did. The move is so incredible that if it wasn't recorded, no one would believe it. But the big question is, how did he do it? Well, here's the secret. Unlike other powerful fight moves that require raw power, the 1-inch punch is actually more about what goes on in the brain than physical strength. For Bruce Lee, the idea was to travel a tiny distance in mere milliseconds. So it's not just the arms moving, but his entire body. Jessica Rose, a biomechanical researcher at Stanford University, has studied this move extensively. And according to her analysis, Lee's lightning-fast move actually starts with his legs. In this incredible footage, you can see his leading and trailing legs straighten with a rapid, explosive knee extension. The momentum then goes straight into his hips, then his shoulder, and finally thrusts his arm forward. Everything happens so fast that it literally makes Lee look like a superhuman. Apart from the fact that Bruce Lee is probably the most impressive martial artist to ever live, this particular strike is really hard to replicate. On the surface, it looks like a simple strike that shouldn't really have the kind of effect it does. But once the 1-inch punch makes contact with the target's body, it combines the power of some of the biggest muscles in his body into a tiny area of the opponent's body. The idea isn't to strike a large surface area, but to deliver a powerful punch from a tiny distance into a tiny part of the body. But if you thought the 1-inch punch was impressive, you should see the actual clip of Bruce Lee doing his infamous 2-finger push-ups. (1,500). That's the number of push-ups Bruce Lee could do at a stretch without breaking. But what's more impressive than doing an insane amount of push-ups? Probably placing his entire body weight on just 2 fingers non-stop 200 times in a row. While most people would struggle to complete 10 push-ups before breaking down, the legendary Bruce Lee proved he possessed superhuman abilities with his 2 fingers push-ups. Not surprisingly, his record remains unbroken till today. And yes, it's an actual record certified by the Guinness Book of World Records. Not that several people haven't tried to break it. Ali Valizadeh Kajashahi, an Iranian martial artist, currently holds the record for the most 2-finger press-ups done in 1 minute. But even though he managed to do 74 within 60 seconds, he still couldn't beat Bruce Lee's record. Earlier in 1990, 050, Paul Lynch from the UK broke the Guinness World Record for the most consecutive 1-finger push-ups, grinding out 124 before giving up. Obviously, that wasn't the same category, But even with that in mind, it still doesn't beat Bruce Lee's record. Safe to say, Lee was a once-in-a-lifetime athlete with superhuman abilities that may never be replicated in any other human. And that's not just his fans glazing him. Even Joe Weider, famously known as the father of bodybuilding, described Bruce Lee's physique as one of the most defined he had ever seen. But that's not the only push-up record he held in his lifetime. As the story goes, Bruce Lee could do 400 push-ups with one hand as well. But was it all just for show-off, or did the push-ups help improve his fighting abilities? Well, the truth is, Bruce Lee's two-finger push-up routine was actually part of his personal martial art philosophy known as Jeet Kune Do. As a master martial artist, he combined a wide variety of other fighting techniques, including Tai Chi, Wing Chun, street fighting, and even boxing. The first time he ever demonstrated this incredible stunt was at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in 1964, wowing the crowd and cementing his legacy as one of the best to ever do it. But if his two-finger push-ups don't impress you, how about the actual records of his real-life fights? From his brutal fight against Chuck Norris in the Roman Colosseum to his 10v1s in Fist of Fury, Bruce Lee really has some of the most iconic fight scenes on television. But there's one question that remains unanswered. Did he actually fight in real life? The short answer is yes. However, the bad news with that is that most of his fights were not recorded on camera, as he preferred to fight in secret. As for the good news, we actually have real footage of a Bruce Lee fight, filmed during the 1967 Long Beach International Karate Championships in California. Here you can see Lee facing off against a few of his top students. So while this was an actual sparring session, Lee was definitely not trying to end his opponent like in the movies. This might explain why his moves aren't lightning fast like you'd naturally see in his movies, and why his strikes don't land as heavily as you'd expect them to. Also, thanks to California law, the fight had to be done in sparring gear. And in case you haven't figured it out yet, Bruce Lee's the one marked with white cords. Throughout the fight, you can see him keeping an effortless distance from his opponent while ducking and dodging every shot sent his way. Standing like a trained killer before his opponent, Lee quietly studies his every move. And from the clip, it looks like he knows what his opponent would do before he does. As for his attacks, Lee had these quick and concise movements that seemed to meet their mark every single time. Imagine a fighter throwing and landing every punch and every kick during a fight. It almost sounds practically impossible, but then it's Bruce Lee, so that makes sense. While the student desperately lashed out when he thought he saw an opening, it turns out Lee was only biting him and would immediately launch a counterattack that left the opponent almost severely injured. Judging by Lee's fighting style in this footage, it's safe to conclude that he may actually be more calm and calculated than he appears in his movies. His style was also distinctly different from every other martial artist of his time, because instead of focusing on a single martial art style, he learned to mix multiple styles to create a lethal combination that no one has ever been able to replicate. But this wasn't just for his movies alone, as he also utilized these skills in actual real-life combat. When the official Karate magazine published its July 1980 edition, one story stood out above every other article in the publication. Told by the famous martial artist Wong Jack Man, it follows a real-life account of a fight between the Wong and martial art legend Bruce Lee. And if it wasn't actually documented, most people would have doubted its authenticity. Just like most of Lee's fights, the duel between him and Wong Jack Man was fought in absolute secrecy, at a time when top fighters would prefer to display their skills in huge arenas before thousands of spectators. Bruce Lee chose to keep his major battles behind locked doors. But the stories couldn't remain hidden forever. This particular one takes us back to the winter of 1964. The setting was a small kung fu school in Oakland, California. At the center of the room was a 24-year-old martial artist, weighing approximately 140 pounds with a 5'7" frame. He wasn't really famous yet, but within a few years, this man would become the biggest martial star in all of history. His name was Bruce Lee, Right beside him on the stage was another fighter, weighing 135 pounds. Standing at 5'10", this fighter was slightly taller, and just like Lee, was also of Chinese descent. His name was Wong Jackman. In this fight, there were no rules, no referees, no safety equipment, and no record to tell us how the entire thing really went. The only source we truly have would be Bruce Lee's wife, Linda, who recalled that 13 people were present that day, including herself. In her book, Bruce Lee, The Man Only I Knew, Linda documented the fight as follows.
To bring the beauty of his martial arts, Chinese Kung Fu.
First, Bruce Lee and Wong Jackman came out, bowed formally, and then began to fight. Wong adopting his Wing Chun style threw a series of straight punches, but Lee was faster, and his punches landed harder, so hard that Wong's men tried to stop the march just a few minutes after it started. But James Lee warned them to allow the duel to continue. Apparently, the attack became so intense at some point that Wong actually turned and ran. But Bruce soon caught up with him and with one swift motion brought him to the ground. Wong surrendered, and the fight was over shortly after it started. The victory was swift, depicting how incredibly powerful Bruce was. But according to Linda, it also pushed Lee to train harder so as to perfect his unique fighting style. Of course, this story has been disputed many times, especially by Wong himself, who claimed that he wasn't beaten to a pulp, didn't beg for his life, and definitely wasn't tackled to the ground. Unfortunately, the only person who can truly confirm or dispute this story died a couple of years after this fight took place. However, how do we talk about Bruce Lee's amazing skills without mentioning his favorite weapon of all time? With 5 of his most popular movies featuring the nunchaku, it's not surprising that it's become synonymous with Lee himself. However, what most people don't know is that Lee absolutely hated them at first. Although nunchucks have been a vital part of martial arts for about 400 years, they weren't exactly the weapon of choice in the 60s, 70s, not that they didn't help during combat. But when you're trying to make a martial arts movie, a nunchaku is the last weapon you'd want to showcase. In most cases, martial artists like Ti Lung, Jimmy Wang Yu and Chang Peipei prefer the Chinese sword. But everything changed in 1971 when Bruce Lee brought the nunchaku into mainstream attention, and it's all thanks to one man, Dan Inosanto. Most people don't know who this guy is, but during Bruce Lee's glory days, Inosanto was a prominent martial artist who trained with him regularly. It was during one of their training sessions that he introduced Lee to the idea of using nunchucks in his movies. But the actor dismissed the idea, calling the weapon a worthless piece of junk. However, Inosanto was quite insistent and eventually convinced Bruce Lee to try it out. Just 3 months later, Lee had fallen in love with nunchucks and was swinging it like he'd been doing it for a lifetime, according to Inosanto. The first time he used the nunchucks in a movie was in 1971 when he released Fist of Fury. The action sequence in the movie alone gave nunchucks massive PR, and just like that, they were cool again. There was even a scene in Game of Death where Lee had a nunchaku fight with Inosanto himself. And although the movie was never completed before Lee's death, the released footage of the film showcased Bruce Lee's nunchaku skills. But as wild as these clips may appear, it's nothing compared to the real-life footage of Lee playing against a professional ping-pong player using a nunchaku. Instead of using a racket like a regular person, Lee summoned his superhuman abilities and incredible reflexes by countering every attack and eventually defeating a professional player in his own sport, all while using equipment that wasn't built for that kind of sport. Sure, Bruce Lee made it look easy, but in reality, nunchucks are incredibly hard to use. Many have tried and failed, and many more have walked away with injuries while trying to wield this simple but lethal weapon. Speaking of lethal weapons, did you know that Bruce once broke an opponent's skull with his bare hands? There is a story written by Bruce Lee himself in his diary, dating back to 1960. It takes us back to the Seattle Edison Technical School, when Bruce got challenged to a fight by a Japanese martial artist known as Yoichi Nakachi, and since he isn't the kind of guy to back down from a fight, Bruce Lee accepted. What nobody expected was that this fight would soon become the bloodiest IRL fight of his career. November 1st, 1960. Bruce Lee and his students just concluded Kung Fu and Judo performances at the Seattle Edison Technical School, where Lee introduced Chinese Kung Fu, describing it as superior to the Japanese Karate and Chinese Jiu-Jitsu. However, the Japanese black belt, Yoichi Nakachi, was in the audience at the time and instantly took exception to Lee's statement about karate originating in China. He also countered Bruce Lee's claim by claiming that Chinese Kung Fu was too soft to be lethal. And to prove his point, he decided to challenge Bruce Lee to a fight. Since Bruce Lee himself was a student at the school, he didn't want to cause any trouble, so he initially declined the challenge. However, his disciples really wanted to see him prove himself in combat, so they kept pushing him. Noguchi himself didn't relent in his efforts to get into a fight with Bruce Lee. The last straw that would eventually break the camel's back was when Noguchi sent one of his own disciples to say to Bruce Lee, "If you want to enter the hospital, accept the challenge." At this point, Lee was so triggered that he decided to accept the challenge. The task of arranging the fight was delegated to Jesse Glover, who chose the YMCA handball field in downtown Seattle as the venue for the infamous duel. This was where things got wicked. When the day finally came, very few spectators were allowed to be present. What they witnessed that day would go down in history as one of the most impressive martial art fights ever recorded. A kick to the nose, blood splashing everywhere, and an opponent kneeling to the floor. Bruce Lee standing and Nakachi lying on the ground. He looked like he was dead, and for a second even Lee was scared that he'd committed murder. Nakachi's face was cracked like he had been hit by a baseball bat, and the left side of his head was so swollen that his eyes were barely visible. However, the irony of it all was that the fight had only lasted 11 seconds. That was all it took for Bruce Lee to completely destroy this karate master, almost ending his life in the process. Surprisingly, though, Lee wasn't interested in rubbing this victory in his face. As a matter of fact, he warned everyone present to avoid talking about the fight, just so he could preserve the dignity of his opponent. But if punching a hole in a person's head doesn't sound crazy enough for you, wait until you hear about that one time Bruce Lee broke a 45-kilogram sandbag with his kicks. Joe Rogan has always spoken about Bruce Lee's legacy, especially the fact that if these Bruce Lee moments were not recorded, no one would believe it. During an episode with comedian Brian Redvan, he credited Lee's contribution to the sport came to be known as mixed martial art. Some would even go as far as claiming that Bruce Lee was responsible for the birth of MMA, which wouldn't be far-fetched, to be honest. According to Rogan, the movie Enter the Dragon was the first time that form of martial arts was witnessed by the public, setting the foundation for an industry that would later dominate sports entertainment. In another episode with The Rock, Joe described Bruce Lee as a trailblazer, highlighting his charisma and undeniable talent, which successfully captured the world's attention within his very short lifespan. But do you believe that Bruce Lee is truly responsible for kickstarting mixed martial arts? Let us know in the comments below. Now let's explore the story of how Bruce Lee. Powerful punches, crazy nunchaku skills, and incredible reflexes. A perfect description of Bruce Lee's fighting skills. But did you know that he also possessed lethal power in his kicks? As the story goes, Bruce Lee was training one day when he suddenly kicked his 45-kilogram sandbag so hard that it literally broke. Using a special kick known as the super sidekick, Lee completely decimated the super heavy training bag. And in case you doubt this story, the record was actually certified by the Guinness Book of World Records, which means it actually happened. There's also another story about how Lee kicked a 135-kilogram sandbag 5 meters into the air. Imagine the sheer amount of force that would be required to throw a sandbag that heavy into the air. Now imagine doing that with a kick. If this feat wasn't actually recorded, nobody would have believed it. And speaking of recording, did you know that Lee's movie directors once claimed they just couldn't keep up with his lightning-fast moves? When The Green Hornet was released in September 1966, it introduced Bruce Lee to a much larger audience, spreading the gospel of Chinese martial arts. Although he was just a sidekick in the movie, Lee's fighting skills were so intense that he literally took the spotlight from the lead character. However, filming the movie was also pretty tough, especially since Bruce Lee's action scene was so intense that the cinematographers just couldn't keep up. According to the book, Bruce Lee, a life written by Matthew Polly, Lee displayed a lot of confidence in how his kung fu skills would look on screen. So much so that he was disappointed when he finally saw the first footage. Because of how fast he moved, the camera couldn't capture his blows, and everything basically looked blurry. Because of this, the scenes had to be filmed all over again, and this time Lee had to slow down his movement significantly just so the kung fu would look better on television. This was very important, especially since kung fu wasn't really popular in American productions at the time. Most of the fighting scenes were patterned towards the more Western fighting styles, which followed a much slower pace and consisted mostly of punches. The cameras filmmakers worked with didn't have a problem filming these scenes, but that changed when Bruce Lee came into the scene. To prevent this kind of issue in his future movies, Bruce Lee shot them at a higher frame rate. So when he made movies like The Big Boss and Enter the Dragon later in his career, he didn't have to slow down his moves, giving him the freedom to produce a more electrifying performance every time. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.